The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way except for the way it sliced through me like a quiet blade. A message from my daughter that did not even carry the warmth of a greeting, just a flat "Mom," followed by instructions that I would not be attending her wedding in person, only through a live stream link, as though my presence could be replaced by pixels on a screen. And in that moment something inside me began to settle into a strange calm instead of breaking, because I realized this was not a sudden cruelty but the final piece of a long story of sacrifice and silence. A story where I had poured money, time, and devotion into raising 2 children after my husband died, believing that love and stability would someday be acknowledged, only to find that when the grand event of my daughter's life arrived, I had been quietly pushed aside as though my usefulness had expired, as though I were simply a bank account that had been drained. I replayed the years in fast fragments. Weekends spent taking double shifts so tuition checks wouldn't bounce, vacations that never happened so braces and textbooks could be paid for, the countless nights sitting up with her on the phone when her life fell apart and she needed someone steady to listen, all of it offered freely without the thought of keeping score, because I thought that was what motherhood meant, and now in exchange I was told to sit at home and watch her say vows to a man whose family apparently decided who counted as family and who did not. My coffee sat cooling beside me, untouched, and rather than rage I felt a slow, deliberate awareness forming, the realization that this was a moment of clarity I had postponed for decades, and in that clarity I answered with 4 plain words. Sure. Enjoy your day. No exclamation marks, no begging, no defense, just the quiet power of withdrawing my role from a stage where I had been both financier and invisible audience. Driving to work that morning through the chill Oregon air, I kept asking myself, how did we get here? How does a life built around devotion get reduced to a joke line about watching online? And the answer whispered back that this was not about one email but about a pattern, a lifetime of giving until there was nothing left of me, a pattern I had mistaken for love when it was really erasure. At the office, people passed my desk with papers and half smiles, and when my boss noticed I looked pale, he handed me a latte without asking questions, and that small act of being seen reminded me that there were still places where my existence mattered, where I was more than the sum of what I could provide, and I tucked that reminder deep inside because I sensed it would be important soon. By lunchtime the phone buzzed and buzzed with messages from my daughter asking me to talk, demanding I respond, insisting this wasn't funny, but I let the calls roll into silence because perhaps for the first time I understood the power of not answering, of not rushing to fix or soften or justify, and in that silence a seed of strength took root, the beginning of a choice that would reshape everything that came after. The rest of that week passed in a haze, yet every moment felt sharper than it should have, as if colors and sounds had turned up their volume now that I was no longer pretending everything was fine. I walked into the office each morning and managed the flow of paperwork, checked calendars, and reminded attorneys of deadlines, while somewhere underneath it all my mind kept returning to the question of what it meant to be a mother who had given almost every ounce of herself and suddenly realized she was seen as disposable. And I remembered the years after my husband's sudden death, when Emily was still in college and Luke was barely starting his adult life. The nights when bills piled up higher than the courage I thought I had. When I stood in front of a washer that barely ran and had to choose between groceries or tuition. When I told myself there would be time for my dreams later, that raising them was more important than rest or comfort or even my own health. And I carried those choices as if they were medals when in truth they were chains. I replayed memories that had grown dusty at the edges. Sending Emily money for her deposit on an apartment in New York, answering her phone calls at midnight when another heartbreak shattered her confidence, writing a check for Luke when he wanted to buy his first house with his fiancée, never once thinking to ask if they truly appreciated the cost, because love had made me blind to the slow erosion of respect. The irony was that in public my children looked like the polished, grateful offspring of a devoted parent, but behind closed doors the gratitude rarely surfaced. It was always assumed, like background music no one notices until it stops. That Tuesday after canceling the transfer, I drove home with the strangest sense of lightness, not happiness exactly, more like someone had removed a heavy stone from my chest, and though the phone kept buzzing with calls from both Emily and Luke, I let them pass unanswered because for once I wanted to hear my own thoughts instead of their demands, and what I heard was the whisper that perhaps boundaries were not cruelty but survival. I poured myself a glass of red wine that had been waiting unopened for a family celebration that never came, sat on the porch, and let the fading light wash over me while memories rolled in like waves. Birthdays I planned alone because they had other plans, Christmas dinners where I smiled at an empty chair while pretending it was fine, the car I kept driving until it rattled like an old tin can because every extra dollar had gone to making sure they never felt the kind of struggle I had endured in my own youth, and the more I counted those sacrifices the more I realized I had been teaching them not gratitude but entitlement, not resilience but dependency, and that realization burned yet freed me at the same time. When Luke arrived unannounced, his tie loosened, his face tense, and his words sharp with accusation that I was being difficult, I recognized the same pattern. Whenever I stopped supplying what they wanted, I became the problem. Not the years of silence, not the lack of respect, not the cruel email that had reduced me to a spectator at my daughter's wedding. No, it was always me who had to bend further, give more, apologize faster. And in that moment I chose something I had never dared before. I chose myself, telling him firmly to leave, closing the door on his disbelief, feeling my heart pound yet my spirit grow taller inside the quiet house. And for once guilt did not come rushing in, only a steady calm that whispered, "You are allowed to draw the line." That night I slept without the constant churning of thoughts, and the next morning when dozens of missed calls lined my screen, I made coffee and smiled at the silence, because I knew their panic was not about losing me but about losing my money, and though that truth was painful it was also liberating, because it confirmed everything I had been too afraid to admit, that my worth in their eyes had been transactional for years. At the office Robert invited me to lunch, and as we shared pasta he listened without judgment while I laid out the entire story. And when he said softly that sometimes the bravest act of love is setting boundaries with those we give the most to, I felt as though the universe itself had affirmed the choice I made. Because for once I was not dismissed as selfish or dramatic, I was seen as someone worthy of respect, and that recognition was like breathing clean air after years in a smoke-filled room. The days that followed were filled with more messages from Emily, some sharp with guilt, others trembling with desperation, each one a reminder of the chaos my refusal had unleashed. Yet I stayed silent because I knew that if I broke now, if I sent even $1, the cycle would never end, and my children would never learn the cost of what they had demanded of me. And though my heart ached, I also felt the quiet strength of finally choosing not to be erased. By the third day after everything unraveled, the pattern of desperate calls and pleading emails had become a rhythm of background noise I no longer felt compelled to answer. And in that silence I started to notice details of my own life that had been neglected for years: the stack of novels on my bedside table collecting dust, the pottery class flyer I had once tucked into a drawer telling myself maybe someday, the neighbors I always waved at but never stopped to share a meal with because my time and money had always been swallowed by obligations to my children. And suddenly I realized how much of myself had been waiting in storage for a future that never came, a version of me that was not defined by being a mother or a widow or a convenient provider but simply a woman who deserved peace. The emails from Emily grew longer, at first full of anger accusing me of ruining everything, then shifting into fear as venues dropped out, florists cancelled, and Andrew's family started to doubt the entire wedding could move forward without my financial backing. And though part of me wanted to soften, another deeper part understood that if I gave in now I would only be confirming the very belief that had fueled their entitlement, that I was useful only as long as I paid, and useless when I did not, and that was no longer a role I could play. Luke stayed away after our confrontation, perhaps embarrassed or perhaps unwilling to face the reality that his words had not swayed me, and in his silence I felt a strange relief because I did not have the strength to explain again that love does not mean unlimited sacrifice. When Sophia appeared at my doorstep, Emily's oldest friend who had once spent countless nights in sleeping bags on my living room floor, Her presence reminded me of the girl Emily used to be, laughing freely before adulthood hardened her, and for a moment I wondered if this visit would be the bridge toward reconciliation, but Sophia's eyes told me otherwise, filled with the weight of carrying someone else's message, asking quietly if there was anything Emily could say to change my mind, and I answered with the clarity I had been forging all week, "No, there is not, because apologies offered only in desperation are not the same as respect freely given." Sophia nodded, understanding in a way my daughter could not, and when she left I felt the door close not just on her footsteps, but on the endless cycle of begging and forgiving that had defined my motherhood for far too long. At work, my colleagues began to notice a difference. Not the slump of someone defeated, but the steadiness of someone finally untethered. And even Robert commented that I seemed lighter, as though some invisible burden had been set down. And I realized he was right, because letting go was not the same as giving up. It was choosing to stop burning myself to keep others warm. In the quiet evenings that followed, I began to rebuild tiny corners of life for myself, pulling out clay and shaping it clumsily into bowls, laughing at the mess but feeling joy in the act of creating something with my own hands, rereading old novels that once moved me, scheduling dinners with friends who valued my company not for what I could give but for who I was, and these small steps stitched together, a kind of healing that decades of sacrifice had never allowed. Meanwhile, the chaos around Emily grew, and though bits of information reached me through Luke or mutual acquaintances, I stayed uninvolved because it was not my responsibility to salvage a wedding built on exclusion. And when I finally heard that the grand Napa Valley event had collapsed into a rushed backyard ceremony with only a handful of relatives, I felt no satisfaction or gloating, only a quiet recognition that choices have consequences and respect cannot be bought. Weeks later, Emily sent a long email, half confession, half justification, paragraphs of emotions meant to pull me back into orbit. But I read it once and then archived it, not out of cruelty but out of the calm certainty that I did not need to explain myself anymore, that my silence now was the truest answer, and in that silence I felt a peace I had been chasing unknowingly for years. For the first time in decades, I woke each morning not bracing myself for demands disguised as love but considering what I wanted for the day: coffee in the garden, a walk along the river, conversations that left me feeling seen. And in those moments I understood something simple but revolutionary. If my presence is negotiable, then so is my effort, and I no longer owed more than I chose to give. In the weeks that followed, I began to understand that what had felt like a loss was actually the start of a new chapter, because for the first time I was living without waiting for the next demand from my children, without rearranging my life around their emergencies, and instead I was noticing how quiet mornings could feel like gifts, how pouring coffee into a chipped mug and sitting in my garden could feel more nourishing than 1,000 sacrifices made in silence. And slowly I allowed myself to breathe in that freedom, not as an act of rebellion but as an act of survival. I went to work with a steadier step, no longer carrying the invisible weight of wondering when the next request for money or help would arrive, and my colleagues saw the difference, some commenting that I seemed more alive. And I knew they were right because boundaries had lit a spark of dignity that had been dimmed for too long. Emily's messages dwindled after her backyard ceremony, first sharp with resentment, then softened into attempts at apology, but each one came wrapped in the same expectation that I would fold back into my old role, and I refused because I finally saw that forgiveness without change is only permission to be hurt again. Luke stayed distant, perhaps embarrassed by his own words, and though a part of me grieved the silence of my children, another part of me felt strangely at peace, because I realized that relationships built only on obligation are not relationships at all. One evening I attended my first pottery class, hands clumsy and covered in clay, and as I shaped a small bowl I thought about how life too could be reshaped, messy at first, but capable of becoming something useful and beautiful if given care. And in that moment I promised myself that I would no longer postpone joy for the sake of others who refused to see me. I started meeting friends for dinners, laughing at stories that had nothing to do with family drama, rediscovering the woman I had been before grief and sacrifice consumed her. And every time I said yes to myself, I felt another layer of resentment fall away. Emily eventually sent one last email, a long message weaving half-hearted apologies with justifications, explaining how Andrew's parents pressured her, how she panicked, how she wished things had gone differently. But instead of dissecting her words, I simply closed the email and placed it in the archive, because the truth was I no longer needed closure from her. I had already given it to myself. The peace that came with letting go was unlike anything I had known, not loud or dramatic but steady, like a quiet river flowing where once there had only been storms, and I understood now that love without respect is a hollow bargain, and that giving endlessly without boundaries only teaches others to take more. In choosing myself, I had not stopped loving my children, I had simply stopped allowing that love to erase me, and in that choice I found the strength to live as more than a background character in their lives. There is a freedom in realizing you do not have to burn yourself to keep others warm, and every morning I woke reminded me of that truth, filling me with a resilience that no amount of sacrifice had ever given. The spring turned into early summer, and with it came a new rhythm to my life, one that felt unfamiliar at first because it was not dictated by someone else's needs but by my own choices. And in that rhythm I began to rediscover what it meant to belong to myself, to enjoy simple routines like walking through the Saturday market and buying flowers only because I liked their colors, or sitting at a cafe with a book without checking my phone every few minutes, wondering which crisis would demand my attention. And the absence of those constant interruptions was both unsettling and liberating. I found myself reflecting on how many years I had given away without ever questioning if they were truly appreciated, realizing that so much of my identity had been tied to sacrifice that I had forgotten what joy felt like when it came without strings attached. And in that realization came a strange grief, not just for the relationship I had lost with my daughter, but for the younger version of myself who never believed she was worthy of anything beyond giving. Robert, my boss, noticed the changes in me more than anyone else at work, and he began inviting me out for lunches more often, never pushing, just offering companionship and stories about his grandchildren. And those small gestures reminded me that kindness can exist without expectation, that some people simply enjoy your company for what it is, not for what you can provide. Sometimes during those lunches I confessed pieces of the story, how Emily had disinvited me, how I had canceled the payment, how the silence between us had grown into something permanent, and each time Robert would listen with the kind of patience that felt like balm, reminding me that setting boundaries is not selfishness but strength, that sometimes love requires us to say no in order to preserve what remains of ourselves. Meanwhile, I noticed how my body felt lighter too, as though years of tension had been released from my shoulders, because with each day that passed without guilt-driven obligations, I remembered that I had my own dreams once, small but precious, and I started to give them breath again, learning pottery, cooking recipes I had put aside, even joining a local book club where strangers soon became friends. There were moments when old habits tried to creep back in, like when a message from Emily would appear in my inbox and my hand would hover over the reply button. But then I reminded myself that any response written out of guilt would only reopen the wound, and I chose silence instead, not out of cruelty but out of clarity, because silence sometimes speaks louder than explanations that fall on ears unwilling to hear. Luke sent a single message weeks later, short and careful, asking if I was all right, and though I appreciated the attempt, I did not invite him back into the cycle either, because his words during that night at my house still echoed, accusing me of making everything about myself when in truth I had spent decades making everything about everyone else, and I realized it was not my responsibility to convince him otherwise. He would have to come to that truth on his own. Slowly I came to understand that family is not defined by blood alone but by respect, by mutual care. And in that understanding I allowed myself to nurture connections with people who valued me, who noticed when I was quiet, who invited me to sit at their tables simply because they wanted me there. That summer I hosted a small gathering at my house, nothing elaborate, just a few friends from work, some neighbors, food and laughter spilling out into the evening air. And as I stood on the porch watching the glow of candles and hearing genuine joy around me, I felt a peace I had never known at even the grandest family celebrations, because this time I was not funding the happiness of others, I was sharing my own. And as the days stretched into weeks, I began to understand that this was what freedom looked like. Not the absence of love but the presence of choice. Not the collapse of family but the birth of self-respect. And with each passing day the weight of the past loosened further, leaving me stronger, calmer, and ready to live a life that finally included me. Autumn arrived with a crisp edge in the air, and as the leaves began to turn gold I realized how much had shifted inside me over the course of those months, because instead of dreading the upcoming holidays I felt a cautious excitement at the idea of shaping them on my own terms, no longer waiting for invitations that would never come or rehearsing how to be gracious when excluded. And that realization filled me with both sadness and relief. Sadness for the years I had clung to a version of family that only existed when I provided for it, and relief that I no longer had to bend myself into silence to keep it alive. I began to plan small things just for myself, like a Thanksgiving dinner with friends from the pottery class, a simple table full of mismatched dishes and laughter that rang far more genuine than any polished event I had ever attended. And in those moments I noticed how healing it was to share life with people who wanted me there rather than people who expected me there out of duty. Emily's absence became less of a wound and more of a quiet scar, something I carried but no longer examined each day. And though sometimes her face would appear in my dreams, younger, laughing, before years of entitlement hardened her, I accepted that the version of her I loved might resurface someday, but it was not my job to wait in misery until it did. At work I continued to thrive, taking on projects I once shied away from because my energy had always been consumed at home, and Robert often smiled at the confidence he saw emerging, even teasing that he had never seen me stand so tall. And in his kindness I found encouragement to keep stepping into a life where my presence mattered. Luke remained mostly silent, though once he sent another brief message suggesting we meet for coffee, and though I hesitated, I chose not to, because the wounds of that night at my house were still fresh and I wanted any reconnection to come from genuine respect, not guilt. And until I saw that respect I preferred distance. The greatest change, though, was within me. I no longer woke each morning calculating who might need me or how much money I could shuffle around to cover someone else's choices. Instead I woke thinking of what I wanted to cook, who I wanted to see, where I wanted to walk, and those questions felt like tiny rebellions against decades of self-erasure. I took a trip alone to the coast, renting a small cabin near the cliffs where waves crashed endlessly. And as I stood watching the ocean I felt a kinship with its strength, relentless and unyielding, and I promised myself that just as the tide reshapes the shore I too would continue reshaping my life, carving out spaces where respect and peace could exist without compromise. Friends told me I seemed different, lighter, even younger, and though I laughed at their exaggerations, I knew they were right, because carrying your own worth instead of begging others to see it changes the way you move through the world. By the time winter whispered at the edges of November, I was no longer defined by rejection or bitterness but by resilience. And I finally understood that letting go of what diminishes you is not loss but liberation. And with every step forward I carried the certainty that the strongest love I could ever give was the one I finally gave to myself. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of stillness that invites reflection. Nights were longer and colder, yet I no longer dreaded the silence of my house because it had shifted from emptiness to sanctuary, a place where I could light a candle, pour tea, and feel grateful rather than lonely. And in that quiet I thought often about the years I had lost trying to hold together a family that was willing to cast me aside the moment I stopped fueling their plans. And though the memories stung, I found they no longer carried the power to crush me. Instead they served as reminders of how far I had come. Emily's voice lived only in unread messages stored on my phone, and where once I would have anxiously opened them hoping for reconciliation, I now let them sit untouched because I understood that apologies offered under pressure are rarely true. And more than anything I needed actions, not words. Respect, not negotiation. Luke called once around Christmas, his voice hesitant, asking if I would like to join him and his fiancée for dinner. But when I asked directly whether Emily would be there and he hesitated before admitting she expected me to pay for a portion of the meal, I smiled gently and declined, realizing in that moment how easily old habits try to disguise themselves as tradition, and how important it was for me to stand firm. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve with friends from the book club. We laughed over board games and exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. And for the first time in decades, I felt the holiday was about joy rather than obligation, about presence rather than performance. At work, the year closed with appreciation notes from the attorneys I had supported, small acknowledgments of my reliability, and though such gestures might have once felt insignificant, they now shone brightly because they represented genuine gratitude, something I had craved from my own children for years and rarely received. In January, I decided to invest in myself, something I had always postponed, signing up for a wellness retreat on the coast where I learned to meditate, hiked along trails, and sat in circles with strangers who became confidants. And in those conversations, I found comfort in realizing I was not alone, that many parents carried the scars of children who took more than they gave, and that healing was possible when we chose not to let those wounds define the rest of our lives. Slowly, I began to see the pattern of my past more clearly, how I had confused sacrifice with love, endurance with loyalty, and silence with strength, and how those confusions had cost me pieces of myself that I was only now beginning to reclaim. Each day I grew more committed to the new rule I had set for my life. If my presence is negotiable, then so is my effort, and that simple truth became a shield against guilt, reminding me that love is not measured by how much we can destroy ourselves for others but by how honestly we can live without losing our dignity. And so as the new year unfolded, I felt not abandoned but renewed, not empty but free, carrying forward the quiet conviction that the most powerful revenge against being treated as disposable is to build a life where you are anything but. As spring returned a full year after the message that had changed everything, I looked around at the life I had shaped and realized how profoundly different it felt compared to the version of myself that once lived entirely for others. The house no longer echoed with waiting for calls that never came but with music I chose, laughter from friends who visited because they valued me, and the quiet hum of hobbies that gave me joy. And in that transformation, I saw clearly that letting go had not broken me but rebuilt me. Emily's wedding was now only a faint story retold by others, a rushed backyard event that carried none of the grandeur she had once demanded. And though part of me ached at the thought of not being there, I knew deep down that it was not my absence that ruined it but the choices she and her fiancé had made. Choices that prioritized appearances and money over love and respect. Luke kept his distance, his pride still forming a wall between us, but I no longer spent nights agonizing over it. I reminded myself that I had given them the tools to grow, and whether they chose to use those tools wisely was not my burden anymore. My days filled with things I once thought were luxuries. Long walks by the river, evenings trying new recipes, quiet mornings shaping clay into imperfect bowls, and even the start of a tentative friendship with someone from my pottery class that hinted at the possibility of companionship beyond family. At work, I took on new projects with confidence, and Robert's encouragement only deepened my sense that I was not invisible, that there were still people who recognized my worth without attaching strings to it. Occasionally, a letter or email from Emily would appear, filled with half apologies tangled in justifications, and each time I read them with a calmer heart, recognizing that forgiveness could exist without reconciliation, that I could wish her well without opening the door to the same cycle of hurt. What surprised me most was the peace that came from silence, the way not responding carried its own strength, because in that quiet I had finally claimed space for myself. And as I stood one morning in my garden watching the sun rise over the budding flowers, I understood the lesson the last year had carved into me. You do not have to burn yourself to keep others warm. Love that demands you disappear is not love at all. And the most powerful form of revenge against being treated as disposable is to build a life so full and steady that no one can mistake your worth again. If this story has touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and remember to subscribe, because sometimes the bravest act of love is the one you finally give to yourself.